Thank you. So I'll be describing a study that was done with, in conjunction with Alberta Agriculture and the Natural Resources Conservation Board. In 2002, the province of Alberta assumed responsibility for managing for administering manure management requirements at confined feeding operations when the Agricultural Operation and Practices Act was amended. Prior to this, each municipality or county was coming up with their own requirements for manure management and confined feeding operations, ranging from being very strict and prescriptive to essentially having no rules at all. So in an effort to be a bit more consistent from a province-wide scale, the province did this and designated the NRCB to be the board that regulated these activities. There was a stipulation within AOPA that allowed for grandfathering. So if you existed on January 1st, 2002, you had a deemed permit, and whatever you were doing, you could continue to do it. You didn't necessarily have to comply with all the rules and regulations within AOPA. But if you made any changes post-2002, whether that was a change in animal numbers or a change in your facilities related to manure management, then you'd be assessed and you may have to make further changes. This has created some concern for Alberta Agriculture and the NRCB of worrying that some of these older facilities may be posing undue risk to groundwater in the province. And also even that some of the rules and regulations within AOPA itself weren't necessarily based on actual science found in Alberta and what may be happening there. Now, when most people think of Alberta, they think of oil and gas and the oil sands. There's actually a large number of confined feeding operations and agricultural operations that are in the province as well. Over half of the national beef herd for Canada is housed within Alberta, as well as 30 to 40% of all dairy, hog, and poultry operations are within our province. There's three main areas where they're concentrated. There's an area down south here by a city called Lethbridge. That area is affectionately known as Feedlot Alley. Obviously, a lot of feedlots down there. We also have a large concentration in between the Calgary to Edmonton corridor, so easy access to transportation, but that's also where a lot of our rural population lives in the province. And then there's another little pocket up to the northwest of Edmonton. Over the last few years, there's been a decrease in the number of operations, but the size of the existing operations is increasing. So we're actually seeing an increase in the number of animals in the province as well, and with that, the associated manure. As far as the hydrogeologic setting in Alberta, where most of these operations are situated, we have three main setups. In the east and in the prairie region, we have fairly thick, competent clay materials, fairly secure portion. Closer to the foothills, get closer to the Rocky Mountains, we get a thin clay till layer, so less than 5 meters thick, overlying a bedrock aquifer. And this bedrock aquifer lies primarily in the Edmonton to Calgary corridor on what's called the Pascapoo Formation, and that's where approximately 300 to 400,000 private water wells are also located. So obviously an area of concern, a lot of operations, a lot of water wells completed. And then we do have some situations where there's unconfined aquifers, so sand and coarse material, either related to existing river and lakes or ones that were around glaciation. In the study, we focused primarily on the manure storage side of things, on liquid storages. That was assumed to be the highest risk, potential risk to groundwater contamination in the province. And we also were trying to tease out the relative impacts from storages and spreading as well. So it's trying to find out the sources. The source is all the same, it's all manure, but is it because of storage and collection facilities, or is there potential impacts occurring more from spreading activities? This is just an example of us actually a hog lagoon, not a dairy, which all of our study sites are dairies, but just of an AOPA-approved earthen liquid manure storage. A lot of our ones, especially in central Alberta, that were pre-2002 are a little less pretty to look at. They're basically holes dug in the ground with a backhoe. When you hit that bedrock layer, which is the aquifer, it's as far as you can dig, that's the bottom of your lagoon. And these are the ones we're primarily concerned about. So as with a bunch of other talks that we've heard about, we had some pushback or lack of cooperation or willing to participate from operators. Of 300 or 400 facilities we went and tried to get to participate. We were lucky enough to get 4 willing to participate in this study. Of these, we were lucky enough that we hit at least one of our hydrogeologic settings, so we had one representative of each of the 3 settings. I'll talk primarily about nitrate, that is What's the biggest concern for groundwater quality and drinking water quality in the province right now is high nitrate levels found in about 30% of our water wells. And we use chloride as the basic conservative tracer throughout the study. We also did do a whole bunch of isotope work as soil, some microbiology, emerging contaminants, and looking at other non-classical methods of monitoring groundwater, but won't have time to touch on all that today. Our setup was kind of a classic hydrogeologic research where we had a bunch of monitoring well locations that included nests of different depths at each one of them. If you look at one example of our operation, it's the dairy. The dairy itself is just this barn here, and then a little exercise pen for the dairy cattle, and the liquid manure storage is just to the south of that. This site also did have a feedlot associated with it, which had a catch basin and a rather large solid manure pile on the surface. This is in the feedlot alley area and is coarse textured or sandy down to about 10-meter depth. Just the general groundwater flow direction for much of Alberta, just from the west to east, a little bit of a north-south component. Our first hint that we definitely were having leakage coming from the lagoon is this one monitoring well had concentrations of ammonia, nitrogen, being up around 400 milligrams per liter. All the other characteristics of this well, of the monitoring well, also fell right in line with what we were getting from our manure samples out of this lagoon. So obvious and pretty distinct that we're leaking constituents from that storage. But as we look at the actual transport of the nitrate coming, or nitrogen coming from this site, we see that the well that had high ammonia, obviously no nitrate's been nitrified yet, but we step out about 50 meters and we start to see a lot of nitrification happening of that nitrogen that was locked in the soil, but then step out another 100 to 150 meters down gradient in the groundwater flow direction. From that storage, we're not seeing a lot of nitrogen moving. A lot of our kind of analysis that we've done behind that has shown or suggested that it's primarily through mixing at this site, just a lot of water moving through this heterogeneous or homogeneous sand and causing a lot of dilution and attenuating. We are getting a bit of denitrification occurring as well down at depth where there's this clay confining layer just over 10 meters at depth, just causing a bit of denitrification. But interesting enough is that up in the northeast corner of the section is where we're seeing our highest concentrations of nitrate, and that's more associated with that solid manure. So although we thought our liquid manure would be the highest source or the highest risk at our site, it's actually that large solid manure pile and some of the feedlot pens that are causing greater contamination of the groundwater. If we move a bit further north up into our thin till over the shallow bedrock aquifer, it's just a dairy this time, no feedlot to worry about. We have our manure storage just in the middle of the pens, and then we have a manure spreading field out in this area as well. A lot of these facilities will also have crops associated with them, and there's more than enough manure to meet all their nutrient requirements, so they don't apply any other fertilizers. Just general groundwater flow again from west to east at this site. If we look at our movement of nitrate, this site really drives home the importance of manure spreading relative to the storage. The storage itself, we don't see much nitrogen contamination coming off or nitrogen leaking to the groundwater. It's being attenuated by either that thin layer of clay, and we're getting a lot of denitrification happening. But you can see that due to the spreading in the fields, we're getting very high concentrations of nitrate coming off the fields. A lot of these study and these sites are very site-specific, and we're going to try to extrapolate them out to a more regional scale. We also are conducting scales that are more regional in context over 100 kilometer transects. We have 2 or 3 of them within the province that we're making some of these conclusions to. Some of the years we've been able to sample monthly. I don't want to get caught up too much in each individual monitoring well and what this says here, but if we look at the green triangles, you can see a lot of variability throughout the year. So although we're not seeing much nitrate moving, there definitely is chloride being released and manure being released into the groundwater, as those chloride profiles for each of the year are following the management of the storage. So as the storage is filling and being used, our chloride concentrations are going up. After the storage is emptied, we've seen the chloride concentrations fall back down. So it's not following the natural pattern there as far as what we'd expect for simple dilution and concentration due to fluctuating water tables. At this site, it's primarily to the actual storage there itself. Similarly, this site isn't quite as pronounced, but a couple of the other sites, within a year, you'll see concentrations next to the lagoon where the storage from being used will vary from 50 milligrams per liter all the way up to 800 milligrams per liter. And so that's leading us to trying to think of, when we require monitoring at a site, what time of year, that your timing of your sampling and the interpretations that you make based on that can vary widely on any given year. Another site in this thin till over the shallow bedrock aquifer, very similar setup with our storage in the middle of the site and then a spreading field to the west. If we look at a graph of our chloride and nitrate concentrations relative to well depth, this is very similar in all of our sites. As we go from left to right, we're going from our shallow wells down to our deeper wells. We can see once we get to about 10 meter depth to anything lower, we're not getting considerable chloride or nitrate being detected at all. And that's suggesting that any kind of movement or plumes that we're having is moving primarily laterally. We're not seeing a lot of vertical migration at all at any of our sites, which is not, it's not good, but it's better from a water well and drinking water perspective. If we look at our chloride concentration, average chloride concentrations over our 6-year period here, see a definite plume of manure constituents coming off of the storage, whereas here we're not seeing much coming off of the manure spreading field to the west. This operator manages and applies at different rates than some of our others, and we're seeing that the storage is actually having more of an impact than spreading. As far as our nitrate concentrations, it was confusing at first as to we saw a plume of the nitrate coming off of the storage but in the up-gradient side of it. And it seems to be that it's likely due to some of the mounding that's occurring at this site as the EMS is being used, or the storage is being used and filling up, getting reducing conditions along the wall and near the base of it, loading nitrogen in the ammonia form in there, and then as the lagoon's empty, we're introducing oxidizing conditions right next to the lagoon. We're getting this slug of nitrate coming off. Kind of funny in this case is that then once it starts to move back under the lagoon, it gets reduced again and it's being denitrified. So it's almost a system working for itself to remove some of the nitrate. The last site, it's not real exciting, but I guess that's the whole point of trying to include it, was this thick clay till site. I won't go into too much detail here, but as expected, we didn't see really any nitrate or nitrogen moving off from the manure storage at all. We do see a little bit of chloride coming up in the wells that are installed right in the berm, essentially, of the manure storage. So there's a little bit of natural seepage that's occurring, but most of those constituents are locked up right close to where storage is. A greater impact that we're seeing at this site is from the septic field from the farmhouse up to the northeast of the site, and that's a bit more movement going through than our dairy EMS. So regardless of our hydrogeologic setting, we seem to be seeing a lot of movement or migration of these plumes going in a lateral direction, not much down, as I said before. This is good from our water well and drinking water quality perspective, and that most of the wells in Alberta will be 30 meters deep or greater. That's not to say if something's happening in the shallow area and we hit a well that's poorly constructed, it can't go down the annulus or anything like that. But from the standpoint of it, it's good. We are seeing that possibly some of the other activities at the sites are having a greater impact on groundwater quality than just the storages of these dairy lagoons, whether that's due to some of the natural sealing and clogging that can occur in the bottoms and walls of these, or whether it's to do with the actual conditions that are occurring, is what we're looking at. On a go-forward basis, there are a few more studies that we're following up on, not only the regional ones, but our one site actually sold his dairy quota and is going out of business. So that'll give us a chance to look at some of our assumptions that once we remove these reducing conditions, we'll get a slug of nitrate coming off of there, and we can follow that for a long time and see the kind of lag time and see what kind of processes will control that going forward This will be important because a lot of the smaller family farm mom and pop operations are going out of business in the province, and it's going to more the large-scale industrial operations. As well, after seeing some of this, one of our operators decided on his own, and for his social license aspect of it, that he wanted to put a liner in himself. So that'll give us a chance to continue monitoring, and he's full aware that it might not solve the problems we're seeing, but it will give us a chance to actually see if that what we're seeing from the manure storage is actually what we're attributing it to. So at the end of the day, I always get asked, well, yeah, you can do a whole bunch of numbers, provide some fancy graphs and everything, but what are we actually going to do with this in the province? And we've always been really kind of trying to be cognizant of that we want to inform our policy and make our rules going forward based on risk. So some of these areas where we have really competent clay tills and relatively secure, maybe we can encourage more operators to move into those areas. They may have less regulations as far as monitoring going forward. And at some of these sites where we require monitoring, how can we better manage these systems? How can we design them better? We don't want to have the monitoring wells real close, because then we're seeing impacts that aren't really a risk to the environment, might not be creating it. Whereas if we start moving out too far, we're going to start getting interferences from a bunch of other things that we're not really trying to monitor. As well, right now in the province, we're geared primarily towards site-specific regulation. But what happens when we have 5 or 6 of these storages all in one quarter section? What's the cumulative effect of that? And start expanding out and looking at the broader picture. Same thing with some of these areas. Yeah, we're not seeing migration moving downwards, but outwards. So what's the potential risks to some of the surface groundwater interactions that are occurring of this loading in the shallow groundwater? I'd just like to thank some of my colleagues at the NRCB and Alberta Agriculture.
Great, thanks very much. Right on time again, so we have a chance for a question or two. Go ahead, JP.
Did you want me to talk into a microphone?
You never need to do that, so
I will touch that. I just had one little question. Earlier in the presentation, you were talking about the loading from the solid manure, or the water quality impacts from the solid manure pile to the, I think, north, as being potentially higher than what's coming from the liquid. And I just wanted to know if that was just based, if that conclusion was based on a concentration found in groundwater, or if that was a calculated sort of rate of delivery of nitrate to the groundwater. We're finding in some of our monitoring that we have very high concentrations under corrals, but that the overall nitrogen that is actually being put in there is less over time, because there's not as much infiltration going on. So just wanted to get your thoughts.
Yeah, in that area itself, we were attributing it to more loading. Just, I think the relative size to it there, the distance of our wells from the 2 different kinds of storages, we're seeing much higher rates of movement of nitrogen going through there. We did see kind of similar results. There's provisions that we can allow short-term manure storage of solids. And one of our other sites, one of the guys decided, oh, I'm going to put my solids for this year right beside one of our monitoring wells. And we actually did see a spike about a year later and go out and say, oh, that was convenient. But then it took about 2 or 3 years to kind of peter out again. So, in that case, the concentrations were high, but the loading rate wasn't quite the same.
one more quick one here.
Yes, I know a few years ago the province of Alberta consolidated all water quality monitoring in an organization called AMIRA, and I was in Alberta in April when they announced that they were cancelling that organization. How does that affect, I mean, is there a good monitoring data set, and I guess how are you working with your monitoring data under this new framework?
Yeah, AMIRA, I guess, was established, say, 3 years ago. It since has been disbanded and moved back within the government under Alberta Environment. Essentially work the same. Their focus was primarily going to be on ambient and regional kind of monitoring and not so much at individual facilities. So even for oil and gas facilities or industrial facilities or agricultural facilities, their focus was never going to be on facility-specific monitoring. It was supposed to be more on a regional context. I don't know, does that answer your question a bit? Or I guess we're working on a system online of being able to share and post all of our data. There's still a lot, especially in the agricultural community, there's a lot of political and legal pressure to not make that information public. Whether that's right or wrong, it's just the way it is. So there's not a lot of sharing between agencies on that kind of monitoring.
So have they made progress on the ambient side? Have they managed to file anything?
They were a bit inefficient on how they were starting up, and that's one of the reasons why they rolled it back into the government. So they've started some things, but haven't been real effective to date.